Good morning. I want to say first, if you're watching this, I'm really grateful. I'm very grateful that you're joining this meeting, and I'm really grateful that you're curious to hear about what we're doing here at this church, at this organization. Um, so the most obvious question that I could address, which is probably a good way to sort of introduce some of our ideas, is why start a church in 2021? There's a lot of reasons to ask that question. Church attendance is at an all-time low, especially in the United States. Churches are having a really hard time starting. They're having a hard time maintaining membership. They're having a hard time achieving their missions. So why would we, in such a difficult time, make the decision to choose to start a church? Well, as with anything, there's sort of two sets of reasons that could explain and provide an answer for that question. One set of reasons is sort of the logical justification, the justification that is sort of the easiest for us to think about intellectually, at least for me, in terms of reasons why I would want to start a church. The second set of reasons is sort of the more personal, emotional, and maybe even spiritual reasons. Why did I feel personally driven to do this? So in order to address both those two different levels of answers, I'd first like to talk a little bit about terms. So when I say church, um, I really am referring to that type of institution in as generic a way as you could possibly conceptualize, without denomination and without a lot of static, dogmatic religious doctrines behind it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So when I say church, I'm going to refer to like any kind of religious structure and organization when I answer this question. So you could think of me saying the word temple, the word synagogue, or just any kind of religious structure will be kind of folded in when I say things like church. The same thing with when I say spirituality, I will sometimes use more generic terms to talk about some of the implications of what we're doing here. And there are a lot of reasons why I'm choosing to use specific terms, but hoping to apply them very generically as I answer these questions. And some of those reasons will hopefully become apparent as I talk more about the reasons why we're here. Some of the other reasons why I'm choosing the most generic possible terms and why I'm hoping to use the terms that I use very generically is because I'm fully aware that for a large portion of the population, if you say words like God or church or religion, um, people's minds tend to automatically turn off. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. And in a large degree, I'm one of those people. So it'll be helpful if we sort of think of our purpose and our mission statement generically. Getting back to the question of why we would want to start a church in 2021. In antiquity, churches really proved to be a super valuable resource for communities. They were a spiritual hub. They were a center for spiritual nourishment. They were a time that communities could come together, and they really anchored the communities that they served. And they served a whole lot of purposes that have sort of fallen by the wayside. And in part, the reason for that is because one of the ways that churches historically have united their membership is through the sharing of common ideals and common religious beliefs. As religious beliefs then became more fractionated and more splintered, um, the power through which people identified with their own religious groups was maybe even a little bit potentiated by that fractionation, by that splintering, because there were fewer and fewer people who sort of met that special criteria of identifying with a certain religious belief. But historically, churches, temples, and other religious organizations have had a really critical role in the way we nourish ourselves spiritually. If you kind of think of humans as multidimensional beings, we do so much to nourish our bodies physically. We exercise, we eat right, we, try to choose the right diet. We try to keep routines of physical activity. If you look at the ways we nourish ourselves mentally, intellectually, we do so much. We do crossword puzzles. We seek out jobs where we can have meaningful intellectual interactions with others. So there are a lot of ways that we intellectually nourish ourselves. There's a lot of ways that we physically nourish ourselves. Even emotionally, we seek to have emotional connections. We go to therapists. We pursue activities that provide us some catharsis. So there are a lot of things that we do to really facilitate our existence on a lot of different levels. But the one level that we often ignore, I think more so than any other dimension of our being and any other dimension of our activity, is the spiritual nature of who we are as individuals. So churches not only have historically provided a resource for communities, they also provided a really important source of spiritual nourishment for individuals. Um, there are a lot of reasons, though, why churches have failed in their mission of spiritually nourishing individuals and communities. And I think there's several different types of failures that churches have had that I've sort of thought of. And in my life, I have attended a lot of different churches, a lot of different religious organizations as a guest, almost never as a really fervent believer or as a faith holder, but it was always sort of as a guest, as somebody looking from the outside in. So why have churches failed to provide spiritual nourishment? And I should say that that is really the main thesis of why we're starting the church. If you take away from this little brief introduction anything, I think one of the important things to take away is that we do want to provide spiritual nourishment. We want to answer the question, can a church be a place of meaningful spiritual discourse? And I'll talk about why that question is really important. But let's talk first about why churches have sort of failed in that mission. Well, I think one of the biggest failures is that churches are not inclusive and are not intersectional enough. So we have, because humans divide things and we categorize things and we stratify things, really separated out spirituality from philosophy and from science. And as inimical relationships initially started between religious organizations and scientific branches of thought, there was, of course, a really important, potent reason why we said, no, if you're science, you can't be religion, you can't be spirituality, you can't be philosophy. Same thing with philosophy. Philosophy was sort of siloed off, put in a separate branch of thought, and it was never integrated back with religious ideas. And I think that's a real shame. So I think the lack of intersectionality between religion, spirituality, philosophy, and science is one of the failures of religious organizations. And I think that's one of the reasons why they've been unable to nourish us spiritually, because there's just no opportunity to develop a holistic spiritual conclusion, spiritual idea, when we silo off science and philosophy and we say these things are separate from spirituality. And I will talk later about why we shouldn't do that, and I want to expand on those reasons. But the first thing that I want to acknowledge is that there is no holistic spiritual growth if we divorce our spiritual dimensions from our intellectual dimensions. All right, so that's one important reason why churches have failed. The other thing, another reason why churches have failed to actualize their mission of providing spiritual growth for individuals and for the community is because churches have historically, and this is true of almost any religion, been based on a static, fixed dogma. You can sort of think of the Bible as the main dogma of the church and Judaism as well, or at least, the Old Testament, as you all know, is Judaism, the New Testament is Christianity. And it's true of the Quran for, the Islamic faith, and every faith has sort of its static dogma. But that dogma is always static, and you can argue in a lot of different religions, you can argue about the interpretation, and that sort of discussion is open in a lot of religions. But you can't argue about the truth of the words themselves. You have to accept that this static dogma is the one thing that's going to guide you for perpetuity, for all of human history, and for all of the human future that's foreseeable. And I think that's a real failure. Ideas have to evolve. They have to be able to breathe. They can't be static. So I think the static nature of the way religions have been built is really problematic. If you think of almost any other field that's really intellectually grown over time, there's always a dialectical component of its growth, meaning that there's discussion, there's argument, people have conclusions, they have ideas, those ideas clash, And then through that fusion, through that clashing, there's a process of evolution where the stronger ideas then emerge. And there has really been almost no opportunity for evolution of ideas through the church and through any religion that embraces a static dogmatic structure, which is pretty much all religions. The third reason why I think churches have failed is that there's always a dyadic interaction. Almost any service I've been to is almost exclusively based on this pattern of interaction where one person talks, they talk about the static dogma, and everyone else is listening, and everyone else is sort of a passive absorber of that knowledge. I think that's problematic too. When I think of the most meaningful interactions that I've had with other people spiritually, it's almost never been an interaction that I've had just by talking to other people. That type of interaction is almost never a nourishing or satisfying or spiritually actualizing interaction. Almost always it's because there's some back and forth, and there should be a lot of back and forth. Even when I give lectures to medical students, to residents in my personal life, there is, always a component of, questions that really make me think these people are engaged in the subject matter. And when those questions are asked and sort of answered in a meaningful way, and we discourse about opinions, about ideas, it becomes a much more intellectually satisfying exercise. So I think churches have already failed because there's always sort of one person at the pulpit or at the lectern who speaks to the audience, and the audience is supposed to passively absorb that knowledge. That's in part because most religions embrace a faith-based structure where you're not supposed to ask questions. But I think it's really problematic because it removes any possibility for discourse and it keeps the audience in a very passive role. So how are we going to address some of these failings of a church? Well, some of them are easily addressed. In this format, because we're a very young religious organization, and again, when I say religious, I really mean spiritual, it's harder to do this. But I hope that as these services progress, especially after the pandemic abates, that there will be more of a discussion format that we will come together and sort of discuss as a conversation and maybe have a few minutes to provide our individual ideas, but then quite a bit more time to discuss and really let our ideas evolve and bounce off each other and embrace the fact that ideas naturally are going to change when other people interact with them. So the whole goal of our spiritual pursuit in establishing this organization is really to ask the question, can spiritual discourse happen? And can that spiritual discourse be a nourishing thing? I realize that a lot of people, like I said at the beginning, myself included, are going to sort of turn off their brains immediately as soon as you start talking about religion. And I understand that. And I feel like if we can address these vicissitudes in the practice of religion, the fractionation of ideas that are scientific or philosophical, the fact that there's no opportunity for discourse, the fact that ideas can't evolve, they have to stay static. If we can address those things, then I think spirituality can become something that is more vital and that will engage more people. All right, so I said at the outset that I'm just going to say a couple more things, but I did say at the outset that there are layers of reasons that I want to address. And for the most part, what I've been addressing have been the more intellectual sides of these layers. But I want to address sort of the personal, emotional reason that is more of a driver in ways that are, a little more difficult to talk about and difficult to describe to someone else. So those, I'm just seeing how we're doing on time because I want to stop at around 10 minutes. But I do want to say personally, I was diagnosed with leukemia. I was told at one point that I would die from leukemia. And that was a very difficult thing. And then I convalesced, and then I got better, somewhat surprisingly. And I actually did pretty well in the end. So when I came back from that, I felt like there were a lot of questions that I've asked all my life that I was still asking, but they were so much more poignant. And they're the questions that humans, I think, are naturally inclined to ask. Questions like, why am I here? What is this for? So after I got better from having leukemia and healed, I felt like a real need to reorient myself with the world and ask myself the question, that was a lot of suffering. Why did I go through that? What is the point of all this? And I did turn to religion, and I really wanted to have a revelation of faith that I've heard a lot of people talk about when they say, I opened myself up and I felt God's presence. I never really had that experience, to be honest. And when I failed to have that experience, I found that the answer that was given to me about why I had had that failure was really unsatisfying, because it was always sort of like, well, you didn't do it right and you've been too close-minded. So I would like personally, for a lot of different reasons, to have a spiritual discourse. I don't think that in this room, in this building, or in what I'm going to say, that I'm going to really find a satisfying answer to the question of why are we here as people and why am I here in my life. I don't think that sort of a satisfying, discrete answer can ever be reached. But I hope that progress will be made on it. And I hope that I'll at least understand the impact of that question to different people. And I hope that I will have experiences in answering that question that are spiritually nourishing. All right, so for our first little episode service here that we're communicating online anyways, we've had other services here in the month of February, but for the first one that we're having that we're communicating online, that's probably enough for now. I did want to introduce people to the organization a little bit in this video, and I wanted to discuss what I hope to achieve with this. And I feel like I've done a little bit of that. And so I hope if you take anything away from this, you take away the fact that we're going to be the type of organization that I hope has a spiritual discourse that identifies and talks about different sources of spiritual nourishment. And some of those sources are going to overlap more with intellectual nourishment and mental stimulation. And some of those sources will be because we're able to discuss with each other. So I think we are going to have a very novel approach to that. And I hope that you'll consider that spiritual discourse is something that merits at least thinking about without turning off our brains sort of on a prima facie level. So thank you very much for tuning in and listening. I'll post this video and our Zoom meetings in the future that we're going to have here that we'll also share online. But I'm really grateful for your support. I'm grateful for those who have tuned in. And I'm really grateful if anyone wants to find us online, message us, ask us more questions about what we're doing here and why we're here. I'm happy to have more conversations about that. Thanks for tuning in and thanks for listening.